Hello, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Lenan Nguyen. I'm a finance reporter at Bloomberg News, and I'm really thrilled to present to you our two speakers today. First, we have Brian Argret. He is the CEO of Citi First Bank in Washington, D.C. And alongside him, we have Brandy McHale. She is Citigroup's head of community investing and development, and also the president of the Citi Foundation. So thank you both for joining us today. First of all, I want to start off with Brian. Brian, you had some pretty interesting and big news to announce at the end of last year. Can you talk a little bit about the deal that you struck with Broadway Federal in LA to create the biggest black-led bank in the US? How's that going? How's the integration going?
Well, thank you. We're first of all, we announced it back in August, and we announced a merger of equals to create the largest minority depository institution in the U.S. Be just over $1 billion in assets, and it's going great. We've received our regulatory approvals. It's a publicly traded entity, so we're have our registration out now, and we're in the integration planning process. We haven't yet closed. We'll be closing shortly, but it's proceeding very well. We're very excited about bringing these two institutions together for greater impact.
I wondered if you could give us a little sense of how this is going to play out in terms of the broader black banking sector. I mean, we know that black banks have really shrunk over the last 20 years. You know, there used to be more than 40 and now there are only about 20. So can you talk a little bit about the industry dynamics that are affecting the minority banking sector?
Absolutely. And this is also why we think this combination is so important. What we're doing is bringing two institutions that are well run and doing fine, if you will, together to create more scale so that we can then turn around and provide more capital directly into the communities, the low and moderate income communities and communities of color, of course, in the African American and Latinx communities, to really double down on impact. And the way in which we plan on doing that is the way we've been doing it. And that's by providing capital for small businesses, for nonprofits who are increasing their scale and their service within the communities, and of course for affordable housing as well.
Great. And I want to bring Brandy into this conversation now. Brandy, obviously you work for one of the biggest banks in the world, and you control, some of its key initiatives in terms of the economy. Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that Citi is doing out in the world to try and sort of narrow the racial wealth gap and to become, as the company says, a more anti-racist institution?
Thank you for the question. In late May, early June 2020, like many companies, we were looking at how we could respond after the murder of George Floyd, say what role could we play in addressing growing racial injustice here in the United States. But we did something a little bit different. We said we weren't just going to only make contributions to leading civil rights and racial justice organizations. We did do that. We thought that was an important step forward. But we use this as a moment to say, not just what can we do to drive good in the world, but what can we do looking internally to say, how do we need to be different so we can drive positive impact in the world? So our Action for Racial Equity initiative was announced in September of 2020, represents $1 billion plus in strategic initiatives designed to close the racial wealth gap. Three things I'd like to point out about it. One is that in developing this strategy, we approach this by making a business case for closing the racial wealth gap. And in fact, when we announced our initiative, we also released first of its kind research around the racial wealth gap that showed that had the U.S. done more to close the racial wealth gap over the past 20 years, we would have added $16 trillion to the U.S. economy today. The second pillar to our approach was just that we, in designing this, decided that we needed to be comfortable being uncomfortable, that there was a lot of light being shown on the challenges and the problems and not enough on the solutions. And while we don't have all the answers, we felt it was important to come forward and to start the process of working on and testing solutions. And then finally, and perhaps most important of all, we knew that philanthropy would be necessary but insufficient on its own to address the challenge.
Brian, you are coming from the largest black-led bank, but in a very small sector within the banking industry. Brandy, you're coming from the opposite side, trillions of dollars in balance sheet. How do your respective institutions help to narrow the racial wealth gap? In Brian's case, do you think that there needs to be more consolidation among the Black-owned banks or the minority banks in order to reach scale and be able to be competitive? And then on Brandy's side, how do banks in their everyday business help to narrow the racial wealth gap? Maybe we'll start with Brian first.
Sure, just directly to your question, I don't know that it's about consolidation per se. The problem is so large and extensive. We do need scale within the individual institutions, but it's not necessary that it's consolidation only to get there. And I want to back up a minute. I'm really pleased that we started off right at the beginning with the fundamental problem, which is the racial wealth gap. And that wealth gap, which we are trying very hard to help alleviate in a number of different ways, really affects every aspect of economic justice and, in fact, social justice for the underlying communities. So it's important to have a discussion not just about the tools, but about the underlying premise. If you don't have a sufficient personal balance sheet, it becomes very difficult to fund a business or to have resiliency with a business going through a period like we are now going through. And likewise, the business balance sheet is exactly the same thing. So it's important for the underlying communities. It's important for the small businesses that we are supporting, which again are the job creation and wealth creation vehicles. And it's important ultimately for those intermediaries, those financial institutions such as the Black-led and Latino-led banks that are out there, again, also driving to directly solve the problem.
And Brandy, you ended on that point that philanthropy is not enough. So if it's not enough, how does the bank help to narrow the racial wealth gap with all of its operational and banking might?
Well, I think first and foremost, it requires a mindset shift to say we can't just build a standalone program or one singular initiative that's going to stand on its own. Can't build a standalone vertical. And so I think to be successful, financial institutions, it doesn't actually matter what size they are, need to look at the role that they play, both as a provider of banking products and services, as a source of financing. We've looked at the power we have as a purchaser of goods and services using our procurement power. And then also, Brian used a word that is so important, which is intentionality, and being very intentional about making choices that say, how are we going to take issues of racial equity into account? So, for example, when we're selecting fund managers, are we doing everything we can to make sure that we're selecting a fund manager that is a firm that is led by a person of color or is a diverse firm versus going with the standard list that we tend to probably use for years and years and years? So I think intentionality. The other thing I would say about we think that partnering with MDIs is so critical, but it may not be for the reasons that we tend to hear. It's not that we think that helping MDIs is the right thing to do, and we do, and we want to support our MDI partners, but we see MDIs as an important component of the financial services ecosystem. And so I think by working with MDIs, we're actually integrating a focus on racial equity within our own industry and building that equity within the financial services industry. And the flip side of that is it's not just what we can do to enable MDIs, but what we can learn from our partnerships with MDIs. We have more to learn from Brian and his institution and their experience that is going to help us to better serve communities and households that need to focus on wealth accumulation.
Great. I think that's a perfect place to leave it. Thank you both for lending your insights into how the banking system can really help to drive racial equity in the economy and how it can reset the economy going forward. So I appreciate your time, Brian and Brandy. Thank you very much.